I was never afraid of anything when I was a teenager of about 15. I wasn't scared of the usual stuff my buddies feared, like talking to girls, not making the football team, or that part of you that gets uncertain about your future. I just took everything as it was and never looked back or worried about the consequences. That is just how it was for me, until the weekend I went hunting with my grandpa, Billy Joe. I had wanted to go away with my best friend Adam and spend the weekend at a water park, but because of a nasty storm on Lake Erie, Adam and his family had to cancel, so I invited him to come hunting with my grandpa and myself. Adam jumped at the chance to go with me and my grandpa because he hadn't been hunting for a few years, and my grandpa was one of the best hunters we both knew. My grandpa liked to hunt deer mostly, and on occasion, wild boar. He had grown up on a farm in Tennessee, and they always killed what they ate and grew all their vegetables and canned them during the winter months. We settled into my grandpa's red Ford pickup truck that morning and headed out to his cabin. 20 miles of nothing except woods surrounded it, and he had only one neighbor by the name of Jake that he would go hunting with in the summer months. We drove out to where the cabin was, and as we slowly approached the road his drive was on, I happened to notice the wooded area just seemed to make it darker. It was even darker still as we approached the cabin, that appeared covered in leaves and dirt, from the wind blowing branches and other items onto the porch. There was an open bag of dog food that my grandpa had for his dog, Lacey. She was a black German Shepherd mix with one blue eye and one brown eye. The bag of food stuck to the wooden porch, as it appeared some animals, raccoons most likely, had gotten into the bag and dumped it all out onto the porch. "Well, shit," said my grandpa, looking back at both Adam and myself, shaking his head. "Ralphie, grab me the broom from inside and a trash bag. I gotta clean this shit up before we attract coyotes." Lacey was over by the dog food sniffing the spilled booty and then sneezed profusely because the wet dog food had gotten into her nose. I gently nudged her out of the way and unlocked the door to the cabin with the key that my grandpa had given me. When I entered the cabin, it was dark and smelled musty. Very little light was coming in from the old plastic pull-up blinds that seemed to have a yellow tint to them from my grandpa's cigarette smoke. White sheets were covering various items of furniture, and the cabinets were all open, just like my grandpa liked to leave them. He didn't want to be startled by the occasional intruder that sometimes found its way into the cabin and made its home inside one of the cabinets. It was the reason that even food was not kept there in the freezer in the cellar. I looked around and had to use the light from my cell phone to see my surroundings. I found the broom and the dustpan and headed towards the porch to clean up the mess while Adam made fun of me. "You will make someone a perfect wife someday, Ralphie," he chuckled. "Very funny, Dick." I rolled my eyes, laughing. My grandpa put the rest of the dog food inside and then went in to light a fire in the fireplace. He removed sheets from a small sofa and a large recliner, which were the only pieces of furniture in the cabin aside from a broken coffee table. I put my backpack and my sleeping bag on the sofa, and then searched for the switch to the lamp next to the recliner, which sat on an old scratched-up round table. There was shockingly electricity in the cabin, but it would shut off occasionally, and so my grandpa had a small generator in the back. I looked down at my phone, and it had no signal. I plugged it in anyway, to let it charge while I helped Adam make himself at home. Not that there was a lot of house, because the cabin was very tiny. I allowed my grandpa and Adam to take the rooms, and I decided that for the first night, I would sleep on the sofa with Lacey at my side. The first night we cooked hot dogs on the grill outside, and hopefully, it would be the last meal we had to buy at the store. I was hoping to find rabbit, as my grandpa had this fantastic recipe for rabbit stew that he often made for us. He would slow cook it over a fire with wild picked mushrooms and some herbs he would bring with him. Hot dogs couldn't hold a candle to my grandpa's stew. After we ate our hot dogs and chatted a bit, we headed to our sleeping areas. I played games on my phone for a bit before I finally closed my eyes and tried to relax. The fire was still going in the fireplace, and Lacey was soon snoring beside me. Spending time in the woods with nothing around reiterates the fact that it gets darker earlier in the deep end of the woods. It was also extremely quiet, which gave way to sound the shadows in the night make. Trees were dancing in the breeze, and I could see them just outside the screen of the cabin window. I heard owls hooting and crickets that never seemed to shut up. It was still early September, and the night was breezy and cold. The cool breeze was a nice escape from the hot afternoon sun that often rose up on these Indian summers. It gently caressed my forehead like a mother's gentle kiss, and my eyelids became heavy. And then I was gone. The next morning, around 5 a.m., my grandpa woke us up to get a good start on the day. I was groggy, but the smell of my grandpa brewing his favorite black coffee stirred me from my slumber. "Here, son, drink this. This black tar coffee will get your insides moving," said my grandpa, shoving a cup of coffee in front of my nose, and then opening the front door of the cabin to smoke his pipe. The smell was just like I remembered it when I was younger, and we would visit my grandma and grandpa in Tennessee. He had already made our little boxed lunches, and I went to wake Adam. Adam was probably the ugliest sleeper, with his mouth wide open, snoring loudly. His hair stuck to his forehead, and I thought it would be funny to stick my finger in his mouth. "Aw, what the fuck, dude?" he said, looking at me, startled from his slumber. "Hey, asshole, it's time to get up." I laughed at him and handed him a cup of coffee. "What the hell is this?" "It's coffee. My grandpa said it helps get your insides moving." "Jesus, I guess. This is the strongest black coffee I've ever tasted, and now I need to brush my teeth." "Why? You want to make out later?" "Maybe," he joked back. We got finished dressing and drinking our coffee, and then we headed out behind my grandpa. Being about 15, we liked to joke and smack each other around. After the fourth slap to the forehead by Adam, my gramps shot us a look. "If you guys want to eat something other than hot dogs tonight, you're gonna need to shut the hell up. They can hear you 2 miles away." We could tell by my grandpa's tone that he meant business. Soon we followed in line behind him and made as little noise as possible. We hiked the woods for a while, rifles on our back, just eyeing our surroundings for anything we could turn into dinner. We went on for a while, and after crossing 3 miles of creek, my grandpa decided we need to sit and take a break. The trail we were on was a narrow one that had a wall of thick rock that overlooked a small cavern. At the bottom of the small cavern was an even more massive body of water that ran into a little swimming hole. There were high layers of the forest all around us, and luckily for us, my grandpa knew these woods like the back of his hand. I held on to the wall as I stepped behind my grandpa. We were moving slowly so that we didn't end up dropping 12 feet down into the shallowest part of the water. The water below us was murky and nothing like the type of water you would swim in. The dirt was so thick that moss seemed to sit just on top of the water in thick gobs. I stood for a second to let Adam catch up, and then as we continued, I nearly ran into the back of my grandpa. He was at a dead stop and shushed me as we got closer to him. I looked at him and was about to mutter, "What?" when I noticed it. There were large pine trees and logs in a circular formation. There were pieces of wood stacked on top of other parts of wood, and what looked like bones of deer and other animals just stacked inside the center of it. It honestly looked like a 30-foot nest or a dumping ground of some kind. I looked back at Adam and placed my finger over his mouth so he didn't utter a sound. The three of us just stood there in awe, looking at it. One thing I noticed was that there were no sounds. Even the sound of the water seemed to stop when we approached the area. I looked down and saw a child's shoe in the water below me, and a chill ran up my spine. What was this we had stumbled upon exactly? My grandpa finally collected himself, and then headed up the side of the trail, which led us into an even more profound and darker part of the forest. That sight, soon behind us, we stopped and sat on an old log. My grandpa didn't skip a beat, and pulled out his lunchbox from his sack. He opened a bottle of spring water and gulped it down in seconds. I just stared at him, unsure of what to do, and then I looked at Adam, who had taken my grandfather's cue, and began eating his lunch as well. Okay, I guess we aren't going to mention that weird ship we saw. And I slowly opened my peanut butter and jelly sandwich, taking a bite. It was a beaver dam, said my grandpa, matter of fact. You think beavers did that? I asked. It is by the water, said Adam, talking with his mouth full. Yep, said my grandpa, taking another bite of his food. Well, I say we head on up here about another mile, and then if we don't find anything, we can start back. We sat in silence for another moment, until Adam let out an enormous belch, and we all started laughing. Sorry, I couldn't help it. When we finished eating, it was close to 10 a.m., and we had been hiking these woods for 3 hours. I found it strange there were no animals in sight, or even the sound of birds chirping. I trusted my grandpa, and I figured he would know the best places to find wild game. We walked for a bit, and then I slowly began hearing what sounded like thunder in the distance. I kept a watchful eye on the sky above us, and the sun was still shining as brightly as ever. We walked more, and then I noticed that the sun that was shining through the trees had disappeared. Something had stolen the sun, I thought, and I stopped, unable to move. I looked up at the sky, and it was still blue just above the tree line. However, I noticed there was a long shadow that was now hovering above us, just slightly near the top of the canopy of trees. I looked to my Gramps for guidance, and he too seemed to have a puzzled look on his face. It was getting darker by the second, and I suddenly felt something wet and gooey fall on my face. It was like a sprinkle of some sort, and then I went to wipe my face and felt it. There was a giant glob of slime that seemed to fall from the sky with no rhyme or reason for it. I could see nothing above us. I turned and looked back at Adam, who was beginning to look as freaked out as I was. Do you hear that, Ralphie? I want you to be as still as possible. I nodded, and then looked at my grandpa as we stood in horror. A strong wind began to pick up, swirling above the branches of the trees. The leaves were rustling, and the branches seemed to thrust up against one another. The trees appeared as though they were being lifted from above, as though something was pulling them out by their roots in slow motion. The trunks creaked and swayed. Run! Yelled my grandpa, as he ran as fast as his old legs could carry him. I ran following him into a little shallow cave just under an old tree. I looked back at Adam. He was right behind me, and then the wind began to move the canopy of trees back and forth so much, I thought a tornado had touched down. I looked back one last time before I caught the edge of the shallow cave opening. I looked behind me, and that is when I realized Adam had vanished into thin air. All that was left was one of his shoes and his bottle of water. I looked up into the trees, and my heart dropped. I looked up into the shadowy bleakness of those tree branches whose leaves had been sucked up into what seemed like a massive vacuum. Adam! I screamed. Get back here now, Ralphie! Yelled my grandpa. Something took Adam! I yelled back, choking back my fear and my tears. My grandpa ran to me, taking out his gun, and in some sort of shock, began shooting up at the sky. He was breathing hard, and he grabbed hold of me by the shoulder. "Ralphie, we will find him. We got to," he said, looking at me with wide eyes. I looked up at my grandfather. He was nearly unrecognizable in his panic. For the first time in a very long time, I saw my grandfather look scared. The last time I had seen that look on his face was when my grandma collapsed in his arms and died of a heart attack. I felt a light breeze blowing through my hair, and then I heard the life begin to come back to the woods around us. The birds started to chirp, and the insects seemed to come into focus again, as a dragonfly flew by the both of our heads. I looked up. Dirt and tears stained my face, and as I looked up into the trees, I could see the branches crooked and broken above me. It was as though something flew down and grabbed him from above and swept him into the sky. We both stood puzzled, looking at one another and at the forest around us. It was as though Adam had disappeared completely into thin air. We continued to search the woods, but we both knew that it was hopeless because he was gone. There was one thing I knew, and that was something from above with wings had taken my best friend. To be continued.